One of the first acts of the new Labour government in the UK was to announce that some prisoners would be let out early because overcrowding meant there simply wasn't capacity for new criminals to be accommodated otherwise. A second lot had been released this week, and it creates a certain amount of fuss and comment, but not so much, because at the end of the day, you notice if you need healthcare and the system is broken. You notice if you've got, for instance, kids in the education system and that system is broken. But the only people who notice if the criminal justice system is broken mostly are criminals and a few of the victims of crime who are sympathised with but ultimately remain in a small minority. So it's very easy for problems to be ignored. The thing is, it's not just the prisons. The criminal justice system in England and Wales is frankly in chaos, has been for some time, and based on advanced discussion of the coming first budget of the new Labour government, it's a crisis that's going to get worse before it gets better. Back in June, the BBC reported on a case in Telford, and it was a routine but ugly incident. There'd been some sort of confrontation on a walking route between four men. 3 of them ended up being charged with grievous bodily harm. That was back in January 2018. If you can remember back to that pre-COVID world, seems like a very long time ago to me. The case was scheduled to go to Shrewsbury Crown Court in September 2019. Then there was a problem at the court, so it was pushed back to November 2020, which is more than a year's delay. Then it turned out that the schedule was a bit busy, so it was pushed back again, more than another year, to February 2022. That also failed, nudged back to November 2022. Then there were problems with court availability because of a workload, and so it was pushed back once more to April 2024. On the day the trial, expected to last 6 days, was due to begin, the court dropped it from the schedule because another trial had overrun. It's now set to take place January next year. That's 7 years after the incident took place. For context, if the accused men had been tried the first time around, found guilty, given the maximum possible sentence, they'd have been out of jail by now. Instead, it's been hanging over the accused, one of whom the BBC reported had a mental breakdown because of the ongoing strain. Maybe you're not so sympathetic to his case because you assume that he's guilty, fine. But you should also remember that we do treat people as innocent until proven otherwise. But then there's also the victim of the incident, who also testified to the negative impact of having this drag on for so long with no support had been offered to them. Unfortunately, this was not reported by the BBC because it's a one-off, extraordinary, unfortunate case. Instead, because it's becoming a very common story. And this is most easily seen in the massive backlog of cases. In early 2019, there were around 33,000 cases outstanding in the Crown Courts, which is a lot. You could have talked about it at the time as something of a crisis, in fact. But by the end of last year, that number had more than doubled to around 68,000. Unsurprisingly, that's a record. And what about since then? Well, we don't know. The Ministry of Justice has found problems with its data, so for now the whole thing has gone dark. But there is no reason to think that there's been any dramatic sudden improvement. In a report on the crisis last week, the Financial Times reported that judges are now apologising to defendants as they give them court dates for the 2 years in the future, and that's even before delays start taking place to those. The article writer for the FT, Henry Mance, noted that public debate focuses on whether police managed to catch criminals in the first place, and also whether the courts will sentence them appropriately. Both of them very valid things to worry about. But the bit in the middle, the process of actually getting your day in court, that bit is more or less invisible, and it has become massively dysfunctional. One criminal barrister, Max Hardy, told VFT, "We're drowning in cases. It's totally unmanageable." Now this has consequences. Barristers report that defendants are less likely to plead guilty because they increasingly see that there's this prospect of conviction becoming more and more remote. It matters particularly with certain types of cases, rape for instance, where delays put immense pressure on the victim, and convincing a jury that the victim is telling the truth becomes harder because after all the time that has passed, inevitably their memory becomes less sure of certain details. All this might be a surprise to some. After all, very soon after Keir Starmer's new government arrived, we had a bunch of anti-immigrant riots. In that instance, offenders ended up in court within hours, or at least no more than a few days. But that was an exceptional event. The authorities wanted rapid justice to be seen to be done to discourage further copycat rioting, which, to be fair, it duly did. The truth is that the average time between the commission of a crime and the Crown Court dealing with it is now sitting at 22 months. That's an average, so some significantly longer waits are hiding within that number. How did we get here? Arguably, it started in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis and the government policy that followed of austerity. According to the FT, since 2010, the justice budget fell 22% per person, even while overall government spending crept up by 10%. But it wasn't just about the money. The fact is that violent crime dropped during that decade, as it did in a number of Western countries. Fewer violent crimes, less need for Crown Courts, which is not an unreasonable conclusion, but government ministers keen to move money to the things that they actually wanted to spend on arguably dived too enthusiastically into that opportunity. The government cut barristers' fees, sold off masses of court buildings, approaching half of the courts were closed. Eventually, the Lord Chief Justice Lord Burnett began to warn that things had gone too far, but it was easy to ignore him. Then the backlog started to creep up. COVID-19 came along and the courts were closed, so the backlog got worse. Then the barristers went on strike over the reductions in their pay, and the backlog got worse. The increasing numbers of people being held in remand in prison while awaiting trial meant that prisons were becoming overstretched. It meant that measures that could be taken to reduce the backlog, such as allowing magistrates more powers to send people to jail for up to 12 months, which would be some cases that would previously have to have gone to a Crown Court, that became impossible in practice because the fact was the prisons were so full you couldn't afford to solve the backlog problem because there wasn't a space in prison for the people who would be sentenced as a result. Oh, and just to complete the comedy of errors, increasingly now court dates are delayed because an overstretched prison system fails to produce prisoners for the hearings, sometimes even loses track of where they are in the system. The private company Serco is supposed to transport prisoners to court, but often fails to do so. It is short of staff, it is short of drivers, has problems recruiting capable people to do the work. At least that's the spirit of their excuses. Apparently, there is also a shortage of barristers. 1 in 4 trials does not go ahead on schedule due to a barrister not being available, either for the defence or for the prosecution. Again, the BBC reported one case in point, where the trial of a man who was accused of threatening someone with a knife had the prosecuting barrister just fail to show up. And the quote was this: "An enterprising lawyer from the Crown Prosecution Service scurried out of the court and returned minutes later with the barrister prosecuting a sexual abuse trial. He walked into court saying, 'I literally have no idea what this case is about. I've not had any opportunity to read anything beyond the indictment.' Unsurprisingly, the case was delayed." Last year, that was just one of 1,436 delayed trials. The challenge is that barristers earn a lot more by doing family cases than they do criminal cases, so they follow the money, leaving junior barristers to have to do as many of the cases that have been left as they possibly can. And as those barristers are overstretched, so the quality of the work for each case drops, which can affect the outcome of the case. The Cameron government cut the budget for legal aid by $300 million. The Ministry of Justice now reports that ended up costing the taxpayer more money than it saved because more defendants chose badly early on in the absence of good legal advice, leading to a lot more expensive time wasting. So this is where we are. To reduce the backlog, there would need to be more expensive court time available, estimated at 6,000 more sitting days. The government has indicated it will support 500. The perverse pay incentives for the barristers to leave the sector to be better paid elsewhere needs to be addressed in order to reverse the flow. Will anything change in the coming budget? If so, you would have expected the seriousness of the issue would have been played up by Starmer and or his ministers. Instead, what we've had mostly is all the short-term pain needed to fill budget black holes. I'm not a betting man, but even if I were, I wouldn't bet on any of this getting better very quickly.